Hello and welcome back to our podcast as we enter our fourth year of scrutinising the BBC and being unashamed supporters of public service broadcasting and media. Now, I know we say every year is a crucial year for the BBC's future, but the next 12 months will be decisive in negotiating the corporation's charter, its right to exist and the public purposes it should fulfil. It is under the cosh financially, of course, and is having to make cuts. But is it in danger of losing the support it needs from key influential figures? A little notice change in the way it runs its written archive centre has outraged historians and biographers, so much so that over 400 of them, including leading figures like Professor David Kynaston and Erica Wagner, wrote to The Observer recently expressing their deep concerns, indeed anger. One of the leaders of the campaign is John Wyver, Professor of Arts on Screen at the University of Westminster, who runs the independent media production company Illuminations, and who from 2013 to 2022 was Director of Screen Productions for the Royal Shakespeare Company. John Wyver, why is the BBC Written Archive Centre so important? Why are you so concerned about these changes?
The Written Archive Centre is an extraordinary treasure trove of social and cultural and political history of Britain since the early 1920s. It is, of course, a repository for documents about the history of the BBC going back to 1922. It's got a lot of files about programmes and people, including, I'm sure, extensive files on your early career, Roger. But it is also
disastrous or controversial it was, yes.
But it's also this extraordinary repository of history about Britain over the last century, and not just Britain, but also the Empire and the Commonwealth.
And it's unique. Is it unique? I mean, it's not just that it gathers information which is available elsewhere. Are there at the heart of this things that aren't anywhere else?
Unquestionably. And I would say that after the National Archives at Kew and probably the British Library, it is the most significant repository of documents about British history, as I say, over the last century, with an extraordinary range of material about all kinds of topics, which historians and researchers have been mining and working with in a very productive way for some 5 decades.
And it's not just about, as it were, the BBC itself. I know you've just authored a book coming out about TV before the Second World War, but it's not just about, as it were, TV, is it? I noticed that among the people who've been very concerned and signed your letter, for example, Erica Wagner, famous historians and others who don't seem to be writing about the BBC, they just seem to be writing about Britain or the world and thinking there are things in this archive they can find that probably they won't find anywhere else.
No, unquestionably. And again, one of the signatories of the open letter expressing deep concern about this is the social historian David Kynaston, who is in the middle of writing a great cycle of social history about Britain since 1945. And I think David would say that there is immense riches in here about all kinds of attitudes and ideas that he would not be able to access in any other way.
I mean, I think you said a serious scandal is unfolding. I think you've said this is a self-inflicted wound that may never heal. Well, let's look at the nature of that then and what the BBC is proposing. And of course, the background is BBC's income in real terms dropping, well, you can argue 30 to 40% over 10 to 15 years. It has to make cuts, efficiencies, and so on. That's the background.
Yep.
So obviously, when it looks at this, what it says is, well, actually, this isn't as bad as you're making out. What they're simply doing is going to arrange for the organised release of material at particular moments. And yes, of course, they're going to have to restrict a little those people who can have access to it. But actually their aim, and they keep saying this, is to make more of it available. Now, let's go through that, really. Who is going to not have access now who would have had access previously?
Well, Part of this is about the narrowing of access from people beyond the professional historians and writers group. So until very recently, it was possible for members of the public to make inquiries of the Written Archive Centre, to visit the Written Archive Centre and use its material, and now that's been closed down. The people who can now access it are established scholars with an academic position or writers with book contracts.
So even though I've paid my licence fee, for example, and therefore over, I don't know how many hundreds of years it feels like, and have actually paid in a sense for this archive, I no longer have access to it as an ordinary person.
That's absolutely right. And the professional historians are no longer able to request parts of this archive to be opened up to address their particular interests and concerns. Now, we have to recognise that, firstly, there is no public catalogue of this archive, which seems to me is totally extraordinary for such an important repository. But also, some 2/3 of this archive has not been made available for anybody to research. So 2/3 of it remains closed and secret. What has been possible until recently is that people with particular interests have been able to request parts of that unopened archive to be reviewed, if necessary, redacted to remove particular pieces of personal information and so forth, and then made available. So that has allowed historians to follow independent paths of research, exploratory, intuitive engagements with the archive, which will no longer be possible. They will only be able to engage with the material that from now on the BBC is prepared to open up and make available.
So do you feel what happened? The BBC will say, oh, well, there's an anniversary coming up. We'll decide to release this material which is relevant to the anniversary. They'll do things like that. But if you get historians doing original research or people with particular expertise who are looking for things and will see clues, that won't see the light of day anymore.
It won't be possible.
I mean, if I was, for example, researching where a particular fascination, obviously, of the Troubles and, let's say, 1970s and what the BBC was involved in, I could decode various things, BBC statements, meetings. I could notice who was missing. I could, so that was said, that contradicts something else, which it is unlikely any archivist, who has to be a generalist in a way, would spot. So some well-intentioned, probably well-qualified archivist will release tranches of information, but the authoritative original historian out there will not be able to identify those little, diamonds, gems that you find, which you think, wow, it just genuinely advances understanding and knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So a colleague, Dr. Kate Murphy, over the past 20 years has been exploring the largely hidden professional lives of women working in the BBC at all levels, from personal assistants up to key executives. She has uncovered an extraordinary range of material about the lives and practices of those women, which the BBC has been very happy to see put into the public domain through her research and books, and indeed now features on their website to demonstrate how open and diverse an employer they have been over the many years. But Kate's work, which required digging away at kind of hidden leads, little mentions of particular women that need to be followed up and patiently explored and exposed, simply won't be possible any longer.
But you see, I don't understand what the BBC's statement means then when it says actually, or claims, it is trying to increase by 30 to 50%, or it hopes to.
Yeah.
The material available, well, on the one hand, they're shutting it down. On the other hand, they say they're opening it up.
They have admirable aspirations to open up, although over an undefined length of time and with no real sense of what they are prepared to open up. They have those admirable intentions. But at the same time, they are preventing engaged, informed, knowledgeable and passionate historians who are prepared to work for nothing. It's not like they're charging the BBC to uncover this material. They are preventing those historians from exploring the things that they feel are important and which, over time, will become very significant in the history of both British broadcasting, but British social and cultural history in general.
Has there been any consultation about this? Did it come out of the blue?
It came entirely out of the blue. The archive went through a process of what they called an internal audit throughout 2024, which restricted access very significantly. And then these new conditions were simply released onto the website in March of this year, and then became part of the responses to researchers making their requests of the archive in emails. But there was no sustained or engaged consultation. There was no discussion with the research community in any way. And to be honest, in the exchanges that we've had by letter with Samir Shah and the BBC board, and in a number of meetings with the executives, the response has been essentially an intransigent resistance to reconsidering this.
Well, let's be sympathetic to the BBC for a moment. They're in obviously a financial hole. They're having to cut back on programmes. They're having to cut back in the news. They're having to cut back in the World Service. And at least those representatives of the news and the World Service and programmes are in at the centre and can argue. Are you worried that things like the Written Archive Centre are not properly appreciated at the centre and don't have an advocate? So when, tough cuts have to be made, nobody's in the room to defend this.
Of course, I can't speak to the internal workings of the BBC, but I think that there is general deep concern across the range of people for whom the archive is very important, both internally and externally, at the way this has been done and the cost saving, which, to be honest, I think we've got to recognise is pretty minimal. There has also been no attempt to engage the research community to think through potential solutions or ways forward for this.
This reminds me a little, sorry to interrupt you a bit, about the changes the BBC proposed in music when it was, cancelling this, that and t'other about 2 years ago. There was immense uproar. There was then consultation. There has then been a compromise. I mean, is that the model you're trying to follow by saying...
It would be very nice to think that at least the provision for on-request vetting and opening of files could be restored. And I do think that that is core to the public purposes of the corporation. This is a public archive paid, as you said earlier, paid for by hundreds of thousands of our licence fees over decades. It is absolutely the responsibility of the BBC to offer, of course, within constraints and, of course, recognising the resource problems and so forth, but to offer proper open access to those who want to explore this extraordinary repository.
And yet, if you're DG, everywhere you move, they say, hold on, we need consultation. And you say, fine, but I've got this year's budget to sort out. It's a bit like the Chancellor of the Exchequer, every alternative is awful, really. And you could see how an impatient, business-driven Director General is actually saying, come on, deliver now, we have to. And we have to be careful not to blame the messenger on this, haven't we?
Yeah, and I'm as sympathetic and concerned about the future of the BBC as anyone else for whom the corporation and its work has been absolutely central to our lives for, in my case, a very long time, both as a producer and as an audience member. So, of course, I worry about how the corporation is going to be resourced and how it is going to move forward over the next decades. At the moment when it is probably in the most precarious position perhaps there's ever been. But in this case, I'm making a case about a very narrow, very specific but I think very important consideration, which I think is core to the public purposes of the BBC as a public organisation. I think that they need to reconsider this quickly and seriously.
Of course, the background to this is the charter negotiations. We know there has to be, basically it's got to be resolved in the next 18 months, or actually slightly less. And, we've been banging on this podcast about the danger of thinking this is just about how you pay for the BBC, or indeed about the BBC itself, and that you want to start in a different place with a wider discussion about what public service broadcasting or media is, where there is a justified case for intervention, and have a discussion about that, and then see to what extent is the BBC still the best way to deliver those purposes, and then how to fund it. And you've always been particularly interested in the arts and done a lot. I mean, you were with the RSC for you were director of screen productions from 2013 to 2022. You've done lots of arts and other programs. There are some who say it doesn't matter anymore. I mean, look at Sky Arts, they're doing things. Don't worry, the arts will look after themselves. It needn't be part of a public purposes anymore. What's your response to that?
To be honest, I despair at the position of the arts on the BBC at the present, and across television, as we've traditionally understood it in general. I'm very disappointed at how the presence of the arts and performance has shrunk radically within the corporation's television output, not so much on radio. I think, clearly Radio 3 and 4 and the other channels do a fantastic job in supporting, engaging and partnering with the arts. But I don't think that's the case with television. I think Sky Arts has done some admirable things, but it's a pretty small and indeed in itself shrunken contributor to this. I do feel very strongly that there needs to be a profound rethinking of the case for public support in media terms across the arts and in other contexts, but the arts is the context I know best, and that should involve the cultural organisations, the Arts Council and other bodies.
Do you think what should happen here in a sense is the BBC should say, OK, these are the resources we've got, this is what we can deliver. It ought to give a vision and say, these are the things we would like to do, these things that we could deliver if we had additional or better funding in the area. What it seems to me to be missing is that vision, and I don't think it's surprising when you look at television. There's a commissioning editor, of course, and I think a lot of people think a rather good one in television, but there's no head of arts. There's nobody with a budget. There's nobody who can set the strategy. There's nobody who can go into the controller's office, where there still are controllers, and say, there's this brilliant new thing happening. Look, we've got to do it somehow. I can get people involved. Trust me. There's nothing like that anywhere. There's no head of arts. There is commissioning by committee.
And there is also a long-standing resistance, I would argue, on the corporation's part towards true collaboration, true exploration with partners on an equal basis. The BBC has, of course, done all kinds of engagements with cultural organisations, but I would argue that has always been essentially on their terms. And to find a way forward and to develop that vision, which I agree with you is, I would say, unquestionably lacking, it needs to be done in a true equal partnership with a range of other informed collaborators who are on the ground, close to creative production in all kinds of ways. And that just isn't the way that the BBC has operated over the past century. And it's very hard for the BBC to find a way forward that has that openness and that true collaborative spirit.
Well, those of us who worked inside the BBC and who love it still and support it still know it often thinks it knows best when it doesn't. If we're looking forward anyway to charter renewal, you obviously, this campaign of yours, which is half about trying to immediately restore particular aspects of the access you had before, but also you have a view of the BBC Charter, or some of your colleagues have, about writing into the Charter something which will protect the Written Archive Centre. Is that really, that's your strategic aim?
Well, I certainly think that within the Charter and within the way in which the BBC moves forward generally, the Written Archive needs to be valued and cherished and protected, and proper access to it also needs to be valued and cherished and protected in ways that at the moment I don't really feel is the case. I think there are also questions about whether the place of the Written Archive now is whether it's appropriate that it is still within the BBC, or are there other places, other institutions, other partnerships which could help take over part of, all of that resource and perhaps run it in ways which can offer better cataloguing and better access. And I think that is a medium-term question that the profession of historians and writers and others, along with the BBC, should address.
Professor John Wyver, thank you very much. Our thanks to John Wyver. Well, if you're enjoying our journalism, please do support us for less than the price of a cup of coffee per month. You can do this by either a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month. Now, by signing up to Patreon, this will also entitle you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. You don't have to read it, but I'll try and make it interesting and informative. The link to this and our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. And that's all for this week. As you probably know, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.